Today our demo is going to cover anti-money laundering and how we see the ServiceNow tool as aiding in the prevention and compliance of regulatory requirements for all financial institutions.
So essentially, we built this demo environment in several iterations. We demoed it to a few US banking customers. So essentially, I just kept on building on it with the help of Melissa and our experienced team. But essentially, the key personas we're targeting here will be the first line of defense employees, the compliance team, and a branch member. And really what we wanted to show is how you can leverage ServiceNow and make your life easier and also prevent non-compliance instances that lead to multi-million fines, right? So that means that for the first line of defense employee, we're leveraging the Employee Center. I'll show you that during the demo, and essentially showing how you can have easy access to AML policies, any standard of operations, procedures, anything they need to know so they understand the responsibilities that they have, what they can do at their own level to make sure that the bank as a whole is compliant with AML regulations such as FinTrack, FinCEN, BSA, and so on. Also showing how, within the task view, you can have a one-stop shop for all the compliance activities. So obviously, we don't want to have a huge compliance burden on them because they have to do their regular tasks, right? So we wanted to show how we can embed that within the process and make it easy. And of course, encouraging them to have a mechanism to report, right? So it could be reporting an issue, a risk event, you see something, you say something type of thing. And also, being able to report on the regulator website, for example. The second persona, compliance team. So we're talking compliance analysts, compliance managers, etc. So through that compliance workspace and the supporting application, showing how we can manage AML content, all the compliance activities that they're either performing, like control testing, or pushing to the first line of defense. So we're talking about attestations, policy acknowledgements, things like that. And of course, leveraging automation, right? So if, for example, a customer has the FSO applications through an integration with their core banking system, they can essentially ingest all the client or transaction data that could be leveraged. So that's what Mel was talking about, like turning something subjective into, measurable indicators. So essentially tracking any large cash transactions, suspicious transactions, essentially being able to have visibility on them, determining how we're going to report them if they need to be reported, and catching any exception. And also like having those automated indicators to capture that in real time so that you don't have, somebody full time, like manually going through the records. And of course, any issue that resolves through that control testing, that monitoring, essentially leveraging the issues management workflow, remediation plan, and so on to make sure that we're in good standing with the regulators. And finally, the branch manager. So essentially here we switch to the FSO workspace, having a dedicated workspace for them to have visibility on their compliance standing at their own level, right? Like it could be a branch, could be a line of service, product, you name it. So essentially just making sure that we're embracing responsibilities, they're committed to be accountable for what they're actually responsible for. And so essentially tracking issues, remediation, and so on as well at their level. So that in a nutshell, who we're targeting and what we're trying to achieve. Just have one more slide before we dive into the demo, but just checking if there's any questions at this point. All right. So the second slide, and that's the last one I promised before we go into the demo, but this is essentially an illustration of how we would handle a use case. So in my demo, it's for large cash transactions. I think in the news reports it was about suspicious transactions, but the concept is the same. So essentially leveraging ServiceNow's policy and compliance solution to manage all the external regulations. So here we have FinTrack, AML, ATF guidelines. For the US, we could be talking about the Bank Secrecy Act, FINRA rules and guidelines, and so on. being able to track each individual section through the citation mechanism, having your own AML policy, and of course, the key piece being able to define a control library. So essentially having controls in place to address those risks of non-compliance, financial penalties, and so on. So of course, through the entity concept, having control instances automatically created for each of your branches, lines of services, or products, and then being able to leverage automated indicators, like I said, like those transaction tables, picking up any transaction that has been reported, for example, and then having a remediation plan to address that. In this demo environment, we also are leveraging audit. So essentially being able to conduct an AML internal audit engagement, for example, prepping before an external one, or just, your regular compliance reviews. And of course, we're also leveraging those workspaces to make sure that everybody has an optimal user experience. So this is essentially what I'll be walking you through today. So just like I showed you in the slide, I'll focus on the first persona, the first line of defense. So here what you're seeing is an employee center. So we're leveraging the Bank of New York environment. So it was configured by our experience team. But like I mentioned, having a dedicated space to manage all the risk and compliance activities related to an AML program. So essentially, everybody would have access to a library of content or task catalog items that they could complete. So we're talking about, for example, the policies. So it's easy for them to have reminders, for example, through a policy acknowledgement campaign that they have to read, understand, and attest that they will comply with it. So again, just within a click, having access to the policy itself, understanding the related tasks, related articles, and so on. Just again, making it easy for them to understand, what they have to complete. And of course, direct links to tasks such as your GRC tasks. So having your GRC queue and seeing everything that you have to complete. So that could be a control attestations, that could be a policy acknowledgement, could be the compliance team asking you for some evidence, or for example, some client ID proofs that you gathered as part of your Know Your Customer onboarding process. So again, really just making sure that in one place you have all information you need, you understand what you have to do, when you have to do it, and why. And of course, being able to report anything, issues, risk events, and policy exceptions. You can even embed links, right? So if we're talking about FinTrack, it has a dedicated web reporting portal, so you can even embed links to it. So again, in one place, having full access to the different components and actions you have to complete. All right, so the second component will be the compliance team. So we're leveraging here the compliance workspace. So again, we didn't customize anything. It's really leveraging the out-of-the-box functionality that ServiceNow has. So namely being able to have your library or external regulations. So you can see I have the FinTrack here. Through that control mapping, control testing, we're able to say, for example, that the Bank of New York has a compliance score of 54% when it comes to FinTrack. So again, it's really meant to be a dashboard for the compliance team to have full visibility on what is going on and addressing any key issue that needs to be addressed. The same can be done for internal policies that are addressing those external regulations. So for this demo, we have a Bank of New York AML policy. Again, we are able to track any exceptions, any issue, as well as the consolidated compliance score that relates to it. The rest is classic compliance indicators, so control testing, attestation, and so on. So if I dive into the policy specifically, just to give you a sense of what is there. So we have our policy for AML. You can manage your entire life cycle, beginning to end. You have direct visibility on your scoring, and then you can dive in and understand, which part of the bank is not compliant. Do we have a particular problem with a line of service, a particular branch? So it's really being able to to allow the compliance team, to understand the root cause of the issue. You can also see that this policy is addressing those frameworks we just talked about, Bank Secrecy Act, FinTrack, FINRA, and we'll be adding additional frameworks as we encounter them with customers, as well as the related risk statements. So I'm not going to go into all of this. That's a lot of content, but again, it's just a way to show how you can manage policy acknowledgement campaigns. So essentially sending out reminders perhaps on a yearly basis to employees to remind them, reread the AML policy that's applicable to you, make sure you understand it, report, ask questions. If you need to get policy exceptions for whatever reason, staff shortage, technology limitations, submit it to the compliance team so we understand the risk exposure. And of course, any issue that's related to it. So that could be a transaction that hasn't been reported within the appropriate time frame. Anything that might arise as you're completing those activities. I mentioned the control objectives. So here we just came up with some sample controls that could be set in place to prevent transactions not being reported. So some key controls like validating customer IDs, reporting large cash transactions exceeding $10,000, could be making sure we have appropriate training, and of course reporting those suspicious transactions as well. So you can have as many controls as you want. So it's really making sure that we don't get into a situation where we actually have non-compliance instances and we have to pay fines. So if I use this one, the large cash transaction, again, at every level, you have visibility on that compliance scoring. You understand the applicability of this control. So that was a key concept that came up with a few customers. You understand which authority documents you're addressing as well. So oftentimes I'll show the 360 view for customers so they understand that and they can visualize that this one control allows them to comply with multiple sections of multiple frameworks. So again, really that concept of test once, comply many. Being able to understand which entities this is applicable, the policies that it's addressing, the risks as well. So, for example, the risk of non-compliance that could result in penalties, for example, which is the situation some banks are finding themselves in. As you know or may not know, so ServiceNow is a mechanism to create instances of that control for any part of the business for which that control is applicable. So essentially, you'd be able to track compliance at any level within the organization. So it really depends. Some customers do it by business levels, process, length of service. But essentially, the point is being able to track compliance of those controls at any level, and then being able to aggregate that at the regulation level or the policy level. So then from there, you can track for my banking and investment division, for example, my control. I can have access to test plans to be able to test that control, and also have automated indicators. So that's what I was mentioning. If we are integrated with FSO, we can go and essentially scan all the cash transactions, capturing those that are above $10,000, for example, and checking if there is an evidence that it's been reported or not. So it's easy way to, in real time, to have visibility. In this case, we have a failure for this particular line of service. So just rounding this up, at the internal audit level, you can also complete AML compliance reviews, internal audits. So again, being able to manage those audits. So again, making sure that you capture anything as it comes or before an external audit. So you can at least show that you identify the issue, it's currently being mitigated, as opposed to not even being aware that this happened, right? So, having your test plans ready to go, any audit tasks, consolidating all those automated indicators. So again, this is an example where I can see that we haven't reported all our cash transactions. In fact, only 83% of them were reported. So essentially, this indicator allows you to identify those 17% of transactions that haven't been reported. So then you can go investigate, mitigate as you can, capturing any clients' accounts that have expired IDs or that don't have any proof of ID whatsoever. Making sure, especially if we have like politically exposed individuals, making sure we conduct proper risk assessment. So it's very much operational, but it also has an impact on your compliance standing.
And remember, lots of these have lots of different variables. So if you have two $5,000 deposits done at two branch locations on one client in one day, then you need to report that within 15 days. Managing all those variables and the timelines is currently typically done with spreadsheets and pivot tables and very manual, intense data analysis at the financial institution. So being able to put those parameters in place in the system, tie it to core banking, tie it to policies and procedures, allows them to prove to any regulatory body how they are moving forward. The regulatory bodies want to just see that continual improvement, that understanding of the rules, and this gives them an end-to-end version of that, which they don't currently have today.
All right, so the last persona and space that we're going to be looking at is our branch compliance dashboard. So I'm within the FSO workspace, and all I did is I created a workspace dedicated to my branch manager. Like I said, it could have been a business unit manager, it could be somebody responsible for a particular line of service or products. And here the goal is to give them visibility on their compliance at their own level. So for the BU that they're responsible for the line of service, for the branch, so they can understand what's their scoring, what do they have to do to improve it, if there's any critical issue or remediation plan they need to monitor. And again, like in real time, being able to track their compliance scoring. And you can even go even further in terms of operational indicators. So essentially here, the FSO use case has an onboarding process, for example, where you're onboarding new customers, you're asking them a few questions, right? You're asking for their IDs and things like that. So you can even consolidate the data that you're gathering through that process and create exception reports, such as, an ID that's about to expire, or, there's no proof of ID that was provided. So as long as you're capturing the data either directly in ServiceNow through that process or through an integration with a core banking system, you can then create as many reports as you want to make sure that everything's running properly. So in this case, we have an example of capturing any client that has expired ID. And then you can even go further down, not just at the client level, but even at the transaction level. So in here, we're capturing all those transactions that meet a particular criteria, and then you can see that one of them hasn't been reported, right? You can even have those SLAs, and then even have a quick link to report that directly onto FinTrack web reporting platform. So it's the same concept as having visibility, having easy access to make sure that we avoid transactions not being reported on time, and having an opportunity to mitigate whatever situation that arises.
Currently, if a large transaction report is missing, what would happen is an email would come in 2 days after the transaction to the branch officer, and then they would have to provide copies back via email within that 15-day time frame. So what we're really trying to showcase here is that You're not taking it out of the system. You're not pulling emails. You have the information at the ready, and you can focus on other capacities, other important pieces that deal with maintaining the bank instead of sending emails back and forth in order to collect a piece of paper that is needed. So one of the things that Zenev's also going to show is how we can build in other pieces, how we have built in other pieces in like a client onboarding experience. So now they don't even have to, the onboarding contains that information, right? From onboarding through maintenance through, and that's an important piece because they don't have an end-to-end a tool at their disposal.
Yeah, so to illustrate Mel's point, so going back to our employee center earlier, we focused on risk and compliance, but there are a few catalog items to manage the client lifecycle. So for example, if a client is applying for a new account, so within the form, you have the ability to, you have the out-of-box form, but you can also add additional fields that directly are tied to, making sure we're compliant, right? Like is the customer like conducting this on behalf of third parties, or like any foreign political exposure, any kind of data you'd have to pick up as part of that process.
So one of the things that's kind of tricky here, and an example I use regularly, is will the customer conduct transactions on behalf of a third party? If my kid has an account and I'm making a deposit, the answer is technically yes, although none of that is suspicious. But if I'm making a deposit into, I don't know, Ferg's account, there's warrant for that to be suspicious. And that's where banks need to have the question asked, the understanding of who's making deposits, and be able to move it forward. So we're trying to showcase right from onboarding through maintenance that it's possible, and that understanding your systems of action versus your systems of record is also critical in changing the financial institution. Yeah, and remember, when it comes to the suspicious versus the large transaction, suspicious transactions need to be recorded as in due course, as soon as possible, as soon as allowable. There's no time frame. It's not time bound in any manner. Whereas large cash transactions have to be reported within 15 days. So this is the tricky that financial institutions are trying to navigate when it comes to proving to FinTrack that they have the training, the policies, the procedures, the practices, the system capabilities in order to comply with both. One that's a bit more variable and a bit more subjective, but extremely important, and one that is a bit more time-bound, consistent, has specific rules and amounts attached to it, and is also equally important to accomplish the goal.